Well, hello everybody, and welcome to my show. My name is Jason DaCosta, and this is Consistent Preterism. Today's show is titled Back to the Futurism Part 2, and those of you may have listened to my first part, Back to the Futurism Part 1, which I just shared. You understand that the focus of these little talks is about people going back to futurism. And I talked about a few people who were desperately searching the scriptures for loopholes to try to force themselves back in, and a passage that just might be worded a different way where it seems a little tricky and confusing, and of course goes against the Everest-sized mountain of proof for the Israel-only position. So they cling to those passages that are very, very questionable at best, and that clash with everything else the Bible says, and they say, nope, this is my in, this is my loophole. So they've been, working hard, producing lots of Facebook content on the early church fathers and how they believe that they were also spreading the gospel and whatnot. And the gentleman, Adam, that I had mentioned in the first video, he actually just came out. I was notified about this. He actually just came out and quoted some old dead guy quotes that say Titus and Timothy were around preaching the gospel well after the not after the coming, because of course nobody knew the coming had already took place. But they basically say that Titus and Timothy were preaching the gospel in certain areas, and he linked it to supposedly be after the coming. Well, again, that just shows that Titus and Timothy earned their place in the failure Hall of Fame shrine, okay, as failures of Christianity, all time, top dog failures, because them, just like John the Apostle, according to this guy Adam and others, totally forgot to mention that Christ had come, that the new heaven, new earth had come, that the immortality was available to anyone in the twinkling of an eye nowadays, that the kingdom is open, that anyone can come and receive immortality, that death has been defeated, that there's no more pain, there's no more tears, there's no more suffering, there's no more death, right? They forgot all this stuff. They didn't mention any of it. So this guy has now included two more disciples from the church, Titus and Timothy, into that category of failure. Okay, and so now John, Titus, and Timothy failed completely in even mentioning once that Christ had come like he promised he would in that generation. So they all had an opportunity to straighten Christianity out and get it on the path to success and the path of peace, but instead they chose not to say a word, and Christianity, or what is called Christianity today, has existed in true discord and true confusion for centuries, thanks to them. And what happens here is, if this is true, right, if first of all, if full preterism is true, which obviously, sorry, I just got a call. That might have broken up a little bit. But as I was saying, if full preterism isn't true, if none of the time statements can be taken at face value, and boy, there are dozens upon dozens of time statements that show the imminence of all these things, then you can throw the whole Bible in the trash. Seriously, because if you're going to believe the Bible in any fashion or in any way, then you must be able to believe the very clear time statements, such as Jesus speaking to people, telling them that he would return before some of them died. Okay, or the book of Revelation, that these events were shortly to come to pass and they were at hand. Right? I mean, what's the sense in reading the Bible if all of these imminent time statements really don't mean what they say? They just mean anything that anybody wants, right? This will shortly come to pass. I am coming quickly. All these things are at the door. The judge is near. He's about to come. All of those things, if they really mean 2,000, 3,000 years or any amount of time that you want them to mean, then nothing in the Bible is concrete, and you might as well throw it into the trash, right? And what this does is, if Timothy, Titus, and John were all here after the coming of the Lord and after that grand inheritance, and they just so happen to forget to mention this single most important transcending fact that transcended people, supposedly, into this glorious age to come, where immortality is a reality for us today, then you may as well throw the Bible in the trash, because it proves that this is all a bunch of nonsense, right? I mean, first of all, you have them not mentioning anything about the most glorious event in all of the New Testament. Nobody knew about it. Nobody. So that makes me question, hey, is this story even true, right? Are these guys even real? right? But of course, we know that the more logical and scriptural argument is in the fact that they were expecting to attain to the age to come. They were, Jesus said, those who were worthy to attain to that age to come would put on immortality. They would become like angels in heaven, and they would never die anymore. All right, everybody has their own way of explaining that away and spinning it away so that it doesn't mean what it says. But the totality of proof in the New Testament shows exactly what that means and exactly what happened to those saints, just like what happened to Jesus at his ascension, and just like what happened to those two witnesses at their ascension into the clouds, into heaven. Okay, so it all fits very tightly. But these people want to come back and say, they probably just forgot to mention it, right? Well, that doesn't work in my book. If they just forgot to mention such a glorious and most important event, then my thing says the whole story is BS. All right, the whole story is BS, because that fact was supposed to change the world. It was supposed to heal the nations. And they didn't even mention it. Nobody knew at all, okay? So your options are as follows. You can either go back to futurism, like Adam and a few others have, and you can start to say that all Israel wasn't saved by the coming. The coming, may have not happened exactly how we think. Maybe there's another coming. You have to basically reinvent the wheel, get a new gospel going, get a new future coming in the scriptures, get a new future final judgment in the scriptures, get a new future destruction of Jerusalem in the scriptures, and you can see the rabbit hole that leads down. And it's not a good one, and it's not going to work, because none of that is in the Bible. So, but beyond all that, just wanted to mention that Timothy and Titus have now joined Johnny Boy in the Hall of Fame Failure Christian Edition. And the other day I mentioned in the part 1 that this gentleman, and I didn't mention his name, but he used to be against IO, then he came aboard. Now he's sort of like questioning it because he's nervous. And frantically searching for a loophole. I think when you think on it, you're like, wow, I'm not part of this story. That's a little concerning, right? So, of course, they start frantically running around, searching, seeking, trying to find answers. And so this guy emailed me. I talked about it in the first one, talking about Luke 21:24, and I kind of talked him off that ledge because it made no sense. And then he came back and he said, well, you make good points. I'm still in agreement. I just want to be consistent. So then a couple days go by and he emails me again. Now this email was just, it just blew me away, because to go from full preterism to consistent preterism, which is IO, and then to end up back where this guy is now, to end up back in the view that this guy is now proposing, is absolutely unbelievable, right? And so I'm going to read you what he said to me, and then I'm going to come back and I'm going to read you some of my replies. But I want you to take notice of how true what I've said in part 1 is. That people will do any and everything to find a loophole. They will operate totally illogical. Nothing makes sense, but they'll convince themselves, because of the fear, that it does make sense. They'll avoid and ignore the mountainous size of arguments and proof for the opposite position, which is IO, and they'll proceed headfirst into utter confusion. And that is exactly what this guy is willing to do here. All right, so I'm going to read you his email to me, and it comes in response to a little comment. Hold on, I'm just trying to pull into a parking lot over here. Okay, it comes from a comment that I made in response to him. And that comment was about the Millennium, because he came back and said, no, the Millennium, the kingdom is delivered before the Millennium, right? So the kingdom's delivered to God, and then the Millennium takes place. So he's trying really hard to find a little loophole here. But this is what he says, okay? He says, no, the kingdom is delivered before the Millennium. Much of what made full preterism work was spiritualizing things. That no longer works, as you have shown. Excuse me. He says, Revelation 14, he, this time, sees 144,000. And is more obvious here, there are two groups. So the email, the text in the email and the actual, wording of things is not always the greatest. In other words, I don't know if he speaks these things into his email, but there's a lot of grammatical errors and words missing. So I don't know if I'm dealing with somebody who's doesn't really know how to write, or if this is one of those cases where he's talking to text and it's just kind of skewing it and he doesn't fix it. So if I read something that doesn't really make sense, that's why. It's because I'm reading it verbatim from the email. But he says, Revelation 14, he this time sees 144K, and is more obvious here there are two groups. The beauty of telling the story different ways brings clarity. What? First one is Israel. Second one is being warned based on what happened to Israel. Then this is repeated in Revelation 20. So do you see the confusion? It's all over the place. Then he continues, he says, and like I always said, we see the kingdom coming down in Revelation 21 after the second group is judged. I know you ignore this, but it's there. This clearly has a significance. Full preterist folks think this is now spiritual. You just ignore it. But I now think it has a literal application. The first group comes down and joins the second, and there are clearly two judgments. So I'm just like banging my head against the wall like, oh man, this is so gross. And then he comes and he says, I think you have done great work. It was the missing link to solve the confusion. Folks missing Jesus only coming for Israel in the first century and 70 AD made the confusion for Revelation 20 and a lot of other doctrinal confusion. As if what this guy has presented to me thus far is actually cohesive, organized, and understandable. That's the irony here. It's like he's blurting out verbal vomit and total confusion here, and then telling me that I think the missing link is this, and folks missing Jesus only coming for Israel in the first century made the confusion for Revelation 20 and a lot of other doctrinal confusion. So it's just kind of ironic. Then he says, God always judged nations, not just for their dealings with Israel. So it's only natural that once he dealt with Israel, he now deals with us. And he says also what is stated in Luke 21:24 happened. So guess what? They couldn't be thrown in lake of fire if they were led away, which they were, which is why there are Jews everywhere today. And Jerusalem was still being trampled until this last century. The argument that all would take place in that generation isn't an argument against. That's it, just against. Then he says, because the things that were to be done then were. Also, to say that all revelation was at hand doesn't apply. It can't all be at hand when there is a millennial gap. Things being at hand clearly are the start of the prophecy. The end can't also be at hand. Oh. In Revelation 20, we see the ones who testified about Jesus and didn't take the mark going to be with the Lord and reigning for 1,000 years or a long time. This cannot, as for believe, be in first century. He's got to be talking to text because this is bad. He says, these are ones who are resurrected in 70 AD, and the rest of the dead, everyone else, don't come to life till after 1,000 years. We have a first and second resurrection. He says, another point of confusion for yourself is Revelation 20 verse 9. He says, the city. There is no problem with this being future. The city is still there, still seen as significant, and many Christians there. And there is no choice but for this to be future, since it is future and distinct from Revelation 18 and 19, which is 70 AD. I see no problem with the gates in Revelation 21 being labeled with the tribes of Israel, because Israel is significant to this. They are the elect, the bride. We, the children of the bride. They are the judges and the priests. Again, I didn't set out to destroy IO or full preterism. That was the best part. Like he's patting himself on the back as if what he just presented took down IO. It's comical, right? Again, he says, I didn't set out to destroy IO or full preterism. Just turns out that just like all the other positions, for and it, still we are not consistent. Makes no sense. And again, I think it is true up until 70 AD. It makes sense of so much that was confusing. It just isn't the end. And for did much for bringing clarity also, because they were setting time statements and the relevance of 70 AD, which most Christians ignore, but it then goes too far. The reality is an amillennial view, but with a twist from the standard amil position. They don't realize Israel as being saved already and what happened in 70. All right, so that was it. And obviously it's painful. It's excruciatingly painful. It's brain-racking. It's brain-numbing. It's brain cell-losing type of content. And it just stems from, again, people getting desperate and frantic to put themselves in the story So they've basically invented new types of doctrine, like a gentleman that I'm going to hopefully get around to doing a critique on at some point in the near future on his kingdom audio. This gentleman's now doing audios telling everybody that the kingdom's now open, yet he admits that Christ wasn't for us. Christ's death had nothing to do with us. We didn't ever need to be saved. There was no redemption or salvation for us. None of that had to do with us, right? Christ has nothing to do with us, but we're part of that new covenant that he made with Jacob, right? And he also says that we're not Israel. So we're not Jacob today when we enter into the new covenant, but yet the new covenant was made with Jacob, aka with Israel, according to Paul in Romans 11. So this guy's got huge problems, but he's now producing videos and content basically trying to be the savior of wannabeism. But what he's done is he's invented his new doctrine. He's invented a new gospel that isn't the Bible gospel, but just an idea that he came up with that said, oh, this has to be the case. The kingdom has to be for everybody today. It just doesn't have to do with Israel because Jesus already dealt with them. But he catches himself in so many contradictions, it's painful. So I'm going to be reviewing that hopefully in the weeks to come and getting around to that. I just really need to sit down, listen to his points again, jot down a few notes, and then roll with it. And that's going to take a couple hours, so I don't have the time right now to do that. These I'm just kind of doing on the fly. But anyways, this cat who wrote this email to me, I responded, I said, dude, you're all over the map. I said, you've become a futurist again, dispensational. I cannot believe it. I said, but actually, I can believe it because you and others are frantically searching the text, trying to find loopholes. I said, your reply is great because I can use it on a show soon to demonstrate this problem. Let's see, I said, for now, here is a brief reply to show how silly your arguments are. So his first argument was that the kingdom was delivered before the millennium. All right, and I said, no, Jesus ascends to heaven and takes his throne seated at the right hand of God. This begins his millennial reign. All right, when Jesus ascends to heaven, he sits at the right hand of God and takes his throne. Okay, that begins his millennial reign. Paul said that the kingdom is delivered to the Father after those who are Christ's are resurrected. Okay, that's 1 Corinthians 15. It says Christ the first fruits, that's at his ascension. Then those who are Christ's at his coming, then comes the end when he delivers the kingdom to the Father. So that comes the end. All those who are Christ are raised in the end, at his coming. Nobody can be Christ after that point, after his coming, because all those who are Christ are raised at the end. But then Paul said also that Christ must reign until all enemies are put under his feet, the last one being death. So the point is, if this guy says that his millennial reign is still ongoing today, then death has not been defeated and Christ has not come. Because Paul said Christ must reign, there's that millennial reign, until all enemies are put under his feet, the last one being death. Well, when was death defeated? At the resurrection, when they were resurrected out of Hades, is when death and Hades were cast into the lake of fire and the dead inherited their promise. So if the millennial reign is still ongoing, and if Christ is reigning right now, Paul said he must reign until all enemies are put under his feet, the last one being death. Then that means that death has not been defeated. Okay, because death is defeated at his coming for those who eagerly waited for him. So he ascends to reign, he returns for all those who are his, and the kingdom is at that point delivered to the Father. All right, then his next argument says, Revelation 14, he sees 144,000, and then there's two groups. The first one is Israel, and the second one is being warned based on what happened to Israel. Then this is repeated in Revelation 20. Now, if you're confused, good, because I'm utterly confused. I said, here's my response. I said, so again, you've become a futurist. You believe the great multitude picture is future. So let me ask you, where are the 12 tribes? Why aren't they standing in heaven crying out in joy and saying salvation belongs to our God? Where'd they go? According to you, the only ones in heaven are that second group, the great multitude from all nations. But that makes no sense, because the only ones sealed for the day of inheritance were the 12 tribes, which you see in the beginning of Revelation 7. Ephesians chapter 1, verses 13 and 14 say that the Holy Spirit was only until they received their inheritance. According to your new view, the 12 tribes were the only ones being sealed on the forehead in those last days, according to Revelation 7. And then they just vanish and disappear, and there is no record of them receiving any inheritance that Ephesians 1, 13 and 14 speaks of. Of course, you are wrong, and the great multitude actually is the 12 tribes from all the nations where they were. Even more alarming is that you are ignoring that the great multitude is said to have come out from the great tribulation. that same great tribulation that Jesus promised would take place in this generation. Dispensational futurism at its finest. You see how much of a mess your new theories are getting you in. And then then his next thing was, he actually responded to that and said, it doesn't say that the great multitude came out from the great tribulation. And I said, what? Why don't you go read Revelation 7? So not only is this guy all over the place, he doesn't even know what Revelation 7 states. It says very clearly that the great multitude from Revelation 7 were the ones who came out from the great tribulation, which was at hand and which was the last days that Jesus spoke of. So obviously these are not future people. That eliminates his argument dead in the water, and he caught himself and was trapped in that reply email after this. And he really had nothing intelligent to say. He just came back and said, I'm just trying to study. I'm just trying to make sure I'm consistent, or something along those lines, right? But moving along in his original email, he said, and like I always said, we see the kingdom coming down in Revelation 21, emphasis on coming down. He says, after the second group is judged. I know you ignore this, but it's there. This has significance. You ignore it, but I now think it has a literal application. The first group comes down and joins the second. What the heck does that mean? So he's got the first group coming down now and joining the second group. So the 12 tribes, I guess, come down from heaven and join the second group, the great multitude. And then he says, and there are clearly two judgments. So I replied, I said, this is getting comical. This is going to be a funny audio when I share it. So wait a minute. You take the symbolic vision of John's coming down, New Jerusalem, totally strict wood and literal, right? But you ignore the multiple passages in the New Testament about the saints going up. LOL, these passages about them being caught up and about them having the upward call and being caught up in the clouds, these were not in the symbolic book of Revelation either, which makes this even more comical. Then you say there's two judgments. So Jesus promised that they'd be judged according to works in that generation and before some died, and you say there is another one? Where is this in the Bible? Dispensational futurism at its finest. Or partial preterism at least, because he sees a judgment and then he sees another judgment. So then he goes, and God always judged nations, not just for their dealings with Israel, so it's only natural that once he dealt with Israel, he now deals with us. And I just responded, LOL, yet you have no passages, just guesses. And then he says, what is stated in Luke 21:24 happened. So guess what? They couldn't all be thrown in the lake of fire if they were led away, which they were, which is why there are Jews everywhere. And Jerusalem was still being trampled until this last century. I said, dude, I have lost lots of respect for you on this one. I said, was the temple still being trampled underfoot last century? Was not one stone left unturned just fulfilled last century? Or was that completed when Jesus said it would be? You are a full-blown dispensationalist. Holy cow. And then he said, the argument that all would take place in that generation isn't an argument against anything, because the things that were to be done then were. Also, to say that all revelation was at hand doesn't apply. It can't all be at hand when there is a millennial gap. Things being at hand clearly are the start of the prophecy. The end can't also be at hand. I just responded to him, holy cow. But the end can also be at hand. We're talking about a 40-year period, okay, of events that ended the age of the people. And that age of the people was quite a long age. We're talking hundreds upon hundreds of years. So a 40-year period can certainly be the end and can also be at hand in scope and in compared against the totality of years in picture. Then he goes on and he says, in Revelation 20, we see the ones who testified about Jesus and didn't take the mark going to be with the Lord and reigning for 1,000 years or a long time. This cannot be in the first century. These are ones who are resurrected in 70 AD. The rest of the dead, everyone else, don't come to life till after 1,000 years. I said, and then I just quoted Paul in 1 Corinthians 15. Christ the firstfruits at his ascension, then those who are Christ's at his coming, then comes the end. There's nothing beyond that. That's the end. Those who were raised at Christ's coming and the kingdom delivered to the Father, that is the end. There's no there's no additional resurrection that's going to take place in the future. All those who were Christ were raised on the last day. All those who were Christ were raised at his coming. And then he said another point of confusion is Revelation 20. I see the city still there. this is significant. Many Christians are there, and there is no choice but for this to be future, since it is future and distinct from Revelation 18 and 19, which is 70 AD. Now, that's just total confusion. I said not worthy of a reply. Very dumb. And then he says, I see no problem with the gates in Revelation 21 being labeled with the 12 tribes because Israel is significant. They are the elect, the bride. We are the children of the bride. So he's saying that people can enter into the city today. Yet Revelation 21 says, and nobody shall enter the city, but only those whose names are found written in the book of life. Daniel chapter 12, when speaking of that book of life being opened, said to Israel, at that time your people will stand before the throne, and the book will be opened, and your people will inherit the promise. So the book of life was opened at the end of Israel's days. There is no book of life part 2. This fella must know of something I don't, that there is a book of life part 2 that's going to be opened at some future end. Because without that, you could not enter the city. Only those written in the book of life could enter the city. And then he says, I didn't set out to destroy IO or full preterism. Blah, blah, blah. He just went on. And I just responded and said, you may have just invented the dumbest hybrid of wannabeism I've ever heard. Congrats, brother. You should be proud. You saved wannabeism. And obviously I'm being extremely sarcastic there. But again, the point in all this is that these guys are so desperate that they are going back to not only dispensational futurism, not only partial preterism, but to new versions, new breeds of confusion, right? I mean, I had to sit and read this thing 5 times, and I still don't understand what he's trying to say. None of it makes sense. None of it in the timeline, none of it in the details. There is nothing organized, nothing cohesive, nothing logical about what this guy just presented. Yet he seems to think that this is his loophole and his way into the story. And again, it all stems from being frantically nervous and fearing that you have nothing to fall back upon because you've been removed from an ancient Israeli salvation story. Okay? So, again, with Timothy and Titus added to the Christian Hall of Fame failure, not telling anyone about the coming of the Lord, not telling anyone about the new heaven, new earth, not telling anyone that there's no more death, right? Just letting everybody rot away in disagreement and hope for things. And like Proverbs said, the heart would grow sick with all this hope that wouldn't come to pass, right? They let that happen. They had every opportunity to not allow that to happen. Literally just opening their mouth and just telling someone. All they had to do was tell one person, and that one person tells someone, and so on and so forth. And then you have, yeah, that's right, I just said so on and so forth. And then you have a domino effect where everybody, for all history, knows that Christ returned, the new heaven, new earth is here. We're in the kingdom now. We have eternal life now. We're immortal now, right? But no, that's not what happened. People have no clue, and there's no unity. There is still death. People still marry, even though in the age to come there was to be no marriage because they'd be like angels in heaven. So it's just a big comical mess. And I just wanted to share that with you in part 2 here, because I could not believe the second email that I received from this guy. It was as if he was looking at night and said, you know what? This is the ticket. This is how it makes sense. And then when he presented that to me, I just shook my head, scratched my head, and said, is this guy serious? It's some of the most confusing stuff I've ever heard in my entire life. And it doesn't change a thing. Anyways, folks, I thank you all for listening to Back to the Futurism Part 2. I appreciate you giving it a listen, and I hope you all have a wonderful day. We'll be back another place, another time, another day, and another rhyme. Bye-bye, everybody.